Over the summer of 2022, I got a new job at Amazon Web Services. I did a bunch of interviewing, I had several different offers, but this video is very long overdue. I wanted to make this to give back to the community and talk about the process that I went through to get the job, the kind of studying I did, and be a bit of encouragement in this kind of difficult time in the market for maybe people looking for a job. So, without further ado, let's jump right in. Quick note, this video is sponsored by nobody, but you and the community. If you find this useful or helpful, consider liking, commenting, or subscribing. It really helps out the channel. So like I said, over the summer, I decided that it was time to go on a new adventure, learn some new stuff, and get a new job. I threw out an application to a ton of different places, small companies, big companies, the FANG companies, just to see what was biting. Now in July of 2022, when I was making this transition, was sort of the tail end of this really hot tech market just before we entered the recession we're in now. Things are a lot different now. But what I'm going to talk about here applies to any situation, and I think could be useful for anybody, even now, landing their dream job. In the end, I had 4 offers, and I was still getting interviews and on-sites, but I decided to cut it short and go straight with Amazon Web Services. It was the most compelling offer to me, and biggest of all, I get to work on some technologies that I'm really, really excited about. My number one piece of advice, and this just goes across the board if you're a software development engineer, if you're in cybersecurity, if you're doing even developer advocacy, my number one piece of advice, and the biggest thing that helped me get all those offers, was study. Study, study, study. All I was doing for a little bit of time was studying leak code, studying design patterns, studying interview prep, a bunch of this stuff to be ready for my on-sites and really impress when I showed up. Probably my favorite resource of all time is the 14 patterns to ace any coding interview question. This is just an article on Hacker Noon that talks about different patterns you can utilize when asked the majority of coding interview style questions. Just 14 patterns. And if you can master those 14 patterns, then you should be able to ace any coding question you get asked. Now, don't get me wrong, these are really tricky patterns and need your time and attention, but if you can apply these 14 patterns, you'll be pretty much set in almost any coding interview. Sort of tangential to that is grokking coding interview patterns, and I went with the Python edition. They have a Java one and a Go one and a JavaScript one, but it's actually the same guy who wrote the 14 patterns article on Hacker Noon. They just turned it into a course with a bunch of interactive questions, so you don't have to go and find those on LeetCode or dig them up yourself. It's all here. It is very expensive, but I found it very worth it for the cost. It helped me really nail down all those coding interview patterns and show up to the interviews again, having really solid understanding of how to ace those coding questions. I also did a fair amount of LeetCode questions, but I was very focused on which ones I wanted to accomplish. I didn't want a ton of overlapping questions. I really needed the best bang for my buck since I was still working, studying all the time, and wanted to land a job through the summer pretty quickly. So I focused mostly on the blind 75. These are 75 questions that have showed up repeatedly and that people on Blind, the anonymous job form site, and these are 75 questions that people would say are the 75 you should really know going into coding interviews. These ones frequently come up, or small iterations of these ones come up. So if you can master these along with the 14 patterns, both of those in combination are really, really good. I didn't do all 75, but I looked at most of them and I accomplished, I would say, probably 40 or so of them. You can also see that they're sort of organized into subsets of questions: dynamic programming, graph, interval, so on and so forth. And you can focus even more on the most critical blind 75 ones to really nail down individual patterns within these individual categories. I did open up the Bible itself, Cracking the Coding Interview. I have read this book before, but it was years ago, and I wanted to be a little more focused in my time, so I didn't go through the entire book, but I did skim through the important sections at the beginning, on Big O notation, on the behavioral interview, and then looked up some of the more important questions inside of this book and went through those ones. And finally, The last supplemental resource I used was Elements of Programming Interviews in Python. I have gone through this book before, but again, it was years and years ago. I used this purely as supplemental material because I was using Python in my interviews. So I referenced this as I needed to if I ran into weird or tricky Python things that maybe made sense to go a little deeper on. If I had to only pick 2 resources I would recommend to focus on, it would be the 14 Patterns to Ace Any Coding Interview and the Blind 75. Both of those together should get you 95% of the way to answering just about any interview question you get thrown. So again, if you take anything away from this video, it's study, study, study. In all, over the 4-5 weeks that I was interviewing and preparing, I probably did about 20 to 30 hours on top of my 40-hour day job per week studying. So that was a lot of my evenings and weekends just studying and pounding out questions, doing leak code, getting ready for those critical on-site interviews. So study, study, study. That is going to be your biggest asset going into these big on-site interviews where you're going to get asked technical whiteboard questions. My second biggest piece of advice is a referral. If you can get a referral, definitely do it. I had a few people that I reached out to directly to get interviews, and it was a really successful path. It sort of allows you to skip over the get to know you recruiter interview phone screen thing, which can be just a really, really great way to fast track into a company that you are interested in. I did that at a few places just with contacts I have throughout the industry and being sort of in the Kubernetes community. So leverage your referrals, leverage those people you've worked with before or that you know in open source communities or really heck, any communities. If you have a referral, use it. It's a really, really powerful way to get your foot in the door somewhere. Next, I want to talk about company principles or company values. Almost any company is going to have some sort of values thing on their website, or even have it as part of their interview process. This should come as no surprise to anybody who's interviewed at Amazon before or looked up details about interviewing at Amazon, but Amazon makes the leadership principles, which are really like the company values, a huge part of the interview process. And I've seen this across many different companies, even the really, really small companies, the startups with just a few people, ask you about their values and what resonates with you, a part of their company values. People want to hire other people that value similar things and that they believe will be a good fit to work with and integrate well with the team. You really will see this most often in the behavioral part of the interview, but this is a really big thing. This sometimes even can be your make it or break it with a company. If you just totally ace it on the whiteboard interview part, but then just totally bomb it on the values and the behavioral part of it, then you're gonna have a really hard time securing that offer. And it really, in my opinion, does come down to that behavioral part if you're on the fence with the whiteboard. So the best thing for you to secure your offer, to secure your dream job, is to not only study for the technical, to not only prepare for the coding, but to also prepare for the behavioral and the values and what that company wants to see in the employees that they are bringing on. Always prepare for that side as well. Next thing I want to talk about is notes. And this may be obvious to some, but others may not find this valuable at all. But I was doing so many interviews that I had to take really in-depth, detailed notes after every single interview just so I could remember it all, remember how well I felt I did, the people I met, the things we talked about, the things that I believed would come up in the next interviews, or even the things that they told me to anticipate in the next interviews. I was probably doing 3 or 4 interviews a week, and that is a lot. That's a lot for anybody to do. So I took very detailed notes to ensure that I was prepared for each next round. And I found just a ton of value in this. I would sit down and review the previous round of notes for the next round, which really teed me up for a lot of success in whatever next round I was going into. And this just continued to compound as I made it to the on-site rounds and then into the offer rounds and so on and so forth. It really made it clear to the people interviewing me that I had a lot of value in their time and that I was willing to prepare prepare not only technically and behaviorally, but also just be excited about what was coming in that company and the things that we were talking about in previous interviews. The next one I want to talk about is open source. I have just a ton of my code open sourced. I've also contributed to a ton of open source projects and open source communities like the Kubernetes community. And that actually had a huge impact across my interview cycles, where people were able to go and look at some of my open source code and some of my open source contributions, the things I've done in the communities, etc., etc. Now, if you are already interviewing and you're not involved in open source, or you don't have a ton of stuff open sourced, then don't worry about it. It's not a blocker to getting an offer at any job really, but it can be a really nice thing so that people can go and look at your code and can go and look at what you've done in the open and in those open source communities. Open source continually is becoming a bigger and bigger part of the software industry. So if you can show that you're already involved and that you already know how to be a good open source citizen, then show that off. Number 6, and I believe maybe one of the most important things, and the last thing I'm going to talk about, is storytelling. Storytelling in an interview is huge, and being able to do it well, it could make the difference between a successful interview and an offer, and a mediocre interview with no offer. Now, there's lots of methodologies out there for storytelling, but I'm going to talk about 2. The STAR method, which is the situation, the task, the action, and the result, is a really powerful storytelling method to have a ton of impact and show the results that you had for something that you did. I also really like the man in the hole method. The man in the hole method is where you sort of start with something up here. You're telling the story where you're digging a hole, digging a hole, digging a hole. And at the bottom of the hole is where you start to dig yourself out. And you talk about the impact and the results you had and the action you had to get yourself out of that hole. A really powerful storytelling method to show the high impact of things that you made and the high impact of things that you did. Practice your storytelling. That's another really important thing here. I prepared like 10 or so high impact stories, and I would practice them. I would practice just talking through them with my wife and my friends, and it made it so that I could show up to the interviews and have a well thought out, well practiced story that I could tell and really apply to many different types of questions. Just even having something written down, something in your mind that you know you want to talk about or that you could talk about, is really big. And this is sort of basic interview prep 101, is prepare for those questions ahead of time, prepare some high impact stories ahead of time so you can show up to the behavioral interview and really impress. Overall, this strategy was really successful for me, and I think you can apply it to most situations and have a ton of success even in the current economic climate today. 1, study. Studying is going to be huge for passing those technical whiteboard interviews, especially with a flood of other candidates. You want to be the one most well prepared. You want to be the one who is the most well studied, who has done the whiteboard questions, and you can come to the interview and really impress at the technical level. Referrals can be really big. If you know people in the industry that you can get a referral from, do it. Leverage your community. Those are huge. 3, leverage the values and the things that those companies want to see from their employees. Do a lot of research on those companies. Look up what their company values are and be able to show up to the interview and talk about them. Taking notes is big, really, in almost any circumstance. Take notes after your interview. Write down what you talked about and what you need to prepare for the next time. Open source is huge for showing your code and giving people the opportunity to see the things that you've done in open source communities, but this one is very optional. And finally, storytelling. Storytelling is huge. It's huge to be able to show up to that interview and talk about some high impact thing that you did so that you can convey how good of an employee you would be, so that then they can want to hire you. Thank you everybody for watching. Remember, like, comment, subscribe if you found this useful or valuable, and I wish you luck. Good luck in your interviews, in your studying, and in your storytelling. Until next time, peace everybody.